They made me sign the papers at the kitchen table, the same table where I used to do my homework, the same table where my mother once told me she was proud of me. My father didn't look at me when he slid the contract across the wood. My mother kept saying, "It's for your own good." The number on the last page read $1. $1. For the company I built from nothing, for the sleepless nights, for the patents they didn't even know existed. I remember holding the pen, realizing something terrifying. They thought they were taking everything from me, but they had no idea what I had already secured. Welcome to my YouTube channel. This is my story of betrayal, and if you've ever trusted the wrong person, hit that subscribe button because you are not alone. Here is how it happened. I was reading comments on my YouTube videos the other day, and I realized I wasn't the only one who had been betrayed by family. Not the dramatic movie-style betrayals, the quiet ones, the ones that happen in living rooms and kitchens, the ones where the people who raised you decide they know what's best, no matter the cost to you. And when I saw those comments, I knew I had to finally tell this story. Because what happened to me wasn't just about money, it was about control. I grew up in a small suburban house where success meant stability. My father worked the same accounting job for 28 years. My mother clipped coupons like it was an Olympic sport. We didn't talk about dreams, we talked about safety. So when I told him at 19 that I didn't want to go to law school like my father insisted, it was the first crack. "I'm building something," I told him. He didn't even look up from his laptop. "You're wasting time." What I didn't tell him was that I had already built the prototype. It started in my dorm room, just me, a secondhand laptop, and an idea that wouldn't leave me alone. A software platform that automated compliance systems for small manufacturing companies. Boring to most people, revolutionary to the right ones. By 21, I had my first paying client. By 22, I dropped out. That was the second crack. My father didn't speak to me for 3 months. My mother called every Sunday, asking if I needed grocery money, as if I were barely surviving. What they didn't know was that revenue had already crossed 6 figures. But I didn't tell them, because I wanted the success to be undeniable. The night everything changed was Thanksgiving. My uncle, my father's older brother, had just sold his auto parts business. Everyone treated him like royalty. My dad kept repeating, "That's what real entrepreneurship looks like." I stayed quiet. Until my cousin, who had Googled me, blurted out, "Wait, isn't your company the one that just partnered with that European distributor?" The room went silent. My father's fork stopped midair. My mother blinked like she'd misheard. And suddenly they were interested. "How much is it worth?" my uncle asked casually. I shouldn't have answered, but I did. Last valuation was just over $8 million. The silence that followed wasn't pride, it was calculation. Over the next few months, something shifted. My father started asking for access to my financials to help with tax structuring. My mother suggested I move the business officially under a family holding structure. They framed it as protection. "You're young," my father said. "You don't understand legal risk." But I understood ownership. And that's when the pressure began. Daily calls, emails from attorneys I'd never met, conversations about legacy. They said the business needed to be under their oversight to prevent mistakes. I refused. And that's when my father did something I never expected. He reminded me that the initial seed money, $25,000, had come from a home equity loan in his name, a loan I had repaid with interest. But legally, the early paperwork was messy. He had been listed as a founding investor. That was my first real lesson in leverage. Suddenly, the conversations weren't supportive, they were strategic. "You don't want this to become ugly," he told me one evening. Ugly? Like I was the threat? Then came the ultimatum. Either I restructure the company under a family trust with my father as managing director, or he would pursue legal action claiming founding equity and fiduciary breach. It would tie up the company for years, kill the investor deal, destroy my reputation. He knew exactly where to strike. I didn't sleep for 3 nights. My legal team told me it would be expensive and messy, but winnable. Investors, however, hate messy. One of them called me directly. "We can't move forward with internal disputes on record." That's when my mother came over, alone. She didn't yell, she didn't threaten, she cried. "Why are you doing this to the family?" she whispered. And in that moment, I felt like a villain in my own success story. The final meeting happened in my childhood kitchen. My father had drafted a buyout agreement to simplify things. The company would transfer to a new entity under family control. The purchase price? $1. He told me it was symbolic. Symbolic of what? Ownership? Control? Obedience? He told me it was temporary, that I'd still run operations, that legally it just made sense. My mother squeezed my hand and said, "Trust us." And I did something that still shocks me. I signed. Because I believed blood meant loyalty. Because I thought parents couldn't possibly want to harm their own child. Because I didn't yet understand that ambition makes some people see opportunity even in their own family. But here's what they didn't know. 6 months before Thanksgiving, before the pressure, before the threats, I had quietly filed 3 provisional patents, not under the company's name, under mine. And the core technology that made the company valuable, it depended entirely on those patents. The ink dried on the $1 transfer. My father finally looked relieved. My mother smiled for the first time in weeks. They thought they had won. And as I walked out of that house with nothing but my laptop, I realized something chilling. They were about to discover exactly what they had actually bought. The morning after I signed away my company for $1, I woke up feeling hollow. Not angry, not relieved, just empty. For 3 years, that company had been my identity. Every line of code, every investor pitch, every late-night bug fix, it had all belonged to me. And now, on paper, it belonged to my parents. I kept replaying my father's face when I handed back the signed agreement. The calm satisfaction, the quiet victory. He believed he had protected the family. What he didn't know was that the core licensing rights for the automation engine, the part every investor cared about, were tied to intellectual property registered solely under my name. Not the company's, not the holding entity, mine. And the licensing agreement that allowed the company to use that technology, it was revocable. 2 weeks later, I received the first email from my father. Subject line, operational transition. He CC'd the new family-appointed legal advisor and my uncle. The tone had changed. Effective immediately, strategic decision-making authority will shift to the managing director. Managing director. Him. They scheduled a board meeting without me setting the agenda for the first time since the company existed. I logged into the video call out of curiosity. My father opened the meeting with, "We are restructuring leadership to ensure sustainable growth." He didn't look at me. I realized something right then. This was never about protection. It was about power. The crack showed faster than I expected. By week 3, the European distributors started asking questions about delayed integrations. My father had paused development spending to reassess costs. He didn't understand the technical roadmap. He didn't understand that compliance automation requires continuous updates to stay aligned with regulatory databases. And he definitely didn't understand that cutting the engineering team by 40% would cripple the platform. But he understood margins and control. Then came the call that changed everything. It was from Lena, my lead developer since year 1. "They're asking for the source code repository access keys," she said quietly. My stomach tightened. "Did you give it?" "No."
because the licensing document you had us sign specifies the court engine is your intellectual property. There it was. The first time the legal structure mattered. Here's what my parents never asked about when they pushed for ownership. They never asked how the technology actually worked. The automation engine was modular. The user interface and dashboards belonged to the company entity. But the predictive compliance AI, the part that analyzed thousands of regulatory updates per minute, that was mine. Licensed. Revocable with 30 days notice under breach conditions. And restructuring leadership without consent triggered a clause. I didn't want revenge. I wanted distance. But when my father sent me a formal demand letter requiring full IP transfer in alignment with ownership rights, something inside me shifted. Ownership rights. He thought the $1 purchase included everything. It didn't. I called my attorney that afternoon. She had warned me months ago. You're protecting yourself in case things get complicated, she'd said when filing the patents. Complicated felt like an understatement now. We reviewed the documents. Clause 4.2. Licensor retains exclusive ownership of proprietary algorithmic frameworks. Clause 7.1. Material governance changes constitute grounds for license termination. My father had unknowingly triggered both. The next board meeting was tense. My father opened with confidence. We've identified a pathway to increase short-term profitability. Translation. Reduce R&D. Increase licensing fees to clients. Freeze innovation. I listened quietly. Then I asked one question. Have you secured transfer of the predictive engine patents? Silence. My uncle shifted in his chair. My father frowned. Those are company assets. No, I said calmly. They're licensed assets. I watched realization flicker across his face, but only partially. He didn't fully grasp it yet. That night my mother called. Her voice was softer than usual. Your father says you're being difficult. Difficult. I almost laughed. I built it, I said quietly. Every line. She sighed. Why can't you just let him handle it? He's trying to help. Help. I thought about the engineers who had trusted me, the clients who believed in our roadmap, the investors who had backed my vision, not my father's. And I realized something painful. My mother still saw me as a child, not as the founder, not as the inventor, just as her son who didn't understand real life. 2 months in, the company's growth stalled. Clients noticed slower updates. Support tickets increased. The European partner postponed expansion. And then came the critical moment. A major compliance regulation shifted in Germany, one that required immediate algorithm recalibration. The engine could adapt in hours, if properly maintained. But key developers were gone. Budgets were frozen. And strategic oversight sat with someone who didn't understand the architecture. The distributor sent a warning. Failure to update within 10 days would void the contract. That contract accounted for 38% of projected annual revenue. I received an email marked urgent from the company's new legal advisor. They needed my cooperation to execute a full IP transfer immediately. Now they were worried. Now they understood the patents mattered. But here's the part no one saw coming. 3 weeks before signing the $1 transfer, I had secured a private agreement with a venture partner. A contingency agreement. If my license were terminated or materially breached, they would fund and fast-track a new entity built solely around my patents. Clean cap table. Fresh governance. My control. I hadn't planned to use it, but it existed. The next meeting wasn't on Zoom. It was back at the kitchen table. My father placed a new stack of papers in front of me. This nonsense ends now. He wanted full assignment of patent rights in exchange for a fair compensation adjustment. $500,000. For intellectual property already valued in the millions. My mother watched silently. I felt that old tug of guilt again. Family. Loyalty. Obligation. But then I remembered the demand letter. The threats. The control. And I realized something with absolute clarity. They hadn't treated me like family when power was involved. They treated me like an asset. I pushed the papers back across the table. I'm terminating the license, I said calmly. My father laughed. Actually laughed. You can't. We own the company. Yes, I replied. You do. He didn't understand until I slid a different document toward him. Formal notice of license termination. Effective in 30 days due to governance breach. Without the predictive engine, the platform would revert to a basic dashboard tool. No automation. No AI. No competitive advantage. In other words, worth almost nothing. For the first time in my life, my father looked uncertain. Not angry. Uncertain. You destroy your own company? He asked. I held his gaze. It stopped being mine when you made me sell it. The room felt smaller than it ever had when I was a kid. My mother's eyes filled with tears again. But this time, something else was there. Fear. Because they were finally realizing something they never considered. The $1 they paid. It might become the most expensive purchase of their lives. And they had just 30 days before they understood exactly why.
The 30-day clock started ticking the moment the termination notice was delivered. Not emotionally, legally. Certified mail, email confirmation, time-stamped acknowledgement. I didn't yell, I didn't threaten, I followed the contract. That's what hurt my father the most. He couldn't call me irrational. He couldn't accuse me of being dramatic. I was calm, clinical, and that terrified him. The first week, he tried intimidation. I received a call from a litigation firm I'd never heard of. They claimed I was violating fiduciary responsibility by sabotaging company value. I forwarded the letter to my attorney. She responded within hours. There is no fiduciary obligation once ownership transferred. The license is conditional. They triggered termination. Translation: I wasn't breaking anything. They were. By week 2, panic started showing through their strategy. Clients were noticing performance degradation. The engineering team, what remained of it, couldn't maintain regulatory updates without the adaptive algorithm layer. Internal Slack messages were forwarded to me by Lena. Does anyone have back-end access to the compliance prediction module? Why are updates failing? Wasn't this auto-scaling before? Yes, it was, because I built it that way. Then my uncle called me directly. No legal tone, no threats, just frustration. You're burning bridges, he said. I thought about that phrase. Burning bridges implies there was still something left to cross. There's no bridge, I replied. You demolished it when you forced the sale. He went quiet. Then he said something revealing. Your father thought you'd eventually thank him. Thank him? For stripping control? For threatening lawsuits? For turning my success into a power play? That's when I understood something deeper. He genuinely believed he was the hero of this story. Week 3 was when the numbers started collapsing. The German distributor formally issued a breach notice. Without predictive compliance adaptation, the platform no longer met contractual standards. That contract alone represented projected multi-million expansion. Investors pulled back from the family entity. I watched it unfold from a distance, detached, but not untouched, because as much as I wanted to pretend this was pure business, it was still my creation unraveling. And that hurt. My mother came to my apartment unannounced. She looked tired, older than she had a month ago. You've made your point, she said softly. This wasn't about proving anything, but I didn't interrupt. She sat on the edge of my couch like she wasn't sure she belonged there. Your father didn't realize how technical it was, she admitted. He thought it was mostly branding and contracts. That almost made me smile. Branding. The value was never the logo. It was the invisible architecture beneath it. I warned him, I said. He didn't want to listen. She hesitated before asking the question that had clearly been rehearsed. What would it take to fix this? There it was. Not apology, not accountability, a negotiation. I looked at her carefully. Control, I said. She swallowed. You'd take it back? No, I replied. I'd build something new. And that was the moment it clicked for her. The old company was already gone.
Even if the license were reinstated, trust was dead. Investors would never forget the governance dispute. Clients would never forget instability. The brand had been contaminated. Day 24. The board called an emergency meeting. My father's voice sounded different, less rigid. "We may have underestimated the IP structure," he admitted. Underestimated. That word did a lot of heavy lifting. He proposed a revised agreement, full restoration of operational control to me, equity restructuring, public statement clarifying strategic realignment. It was close to what I would have wanted months ago, but something inside me had changed. Because now I understood something about power. When someone shows you they're willing to weaponize it once, they'll do it again when it suits them. I asked one question during that meeting. If I restore the license, what guarantees exist that you won't attempt to override governance again? Silence. There are no legal guarantees against ego, no clauses against pride. Day 28. 2 days before termination. The venture partner I had secured months earlier invited me to their office. Glass walls, quiet confidence. They had watched the situation unfold carefully. "We're prepared to activate," the managing partner said. They slid a term sheet across the table. Clean ownership, majority founder control, funding to rebuild with my original engineering team, faster timeline, stronger infrastructure, and this time, no family entanglements. I stared at the document for a long time, not because of doubt, but because of the weight of what it meant. If I signed, there was no going back. Not to the company, not to how things were with my parents. Day 30 arrived quietly. No dramatic countdown, no yelling, just a timestamp. 12:01 a.m. The license expired. The predictive engine shut off. Not violently, gracefully. Failover systems defaulted to basic functionality. Clients logged in that morning to find a slower, stripped-down version of what they once had. By noon, the German distributor terminated their agreement. By evening, 2 domestic clients followed. The company my parents bought for $1 was now hemorrhaging value by the hour. At 8:47 p.m., my father called. I almost didn't answer. When I did, there was no anger in his voice, just disbelief. "You actually did it." "Yes," I said. "You destroyed it." "No," I corrected him. "You did, when you thought ownership meant understanding." There was a long silence on the line. Then he asked the question I'd been waiting for. "What happens now?" I looked at the signed venture term sheet sitting on my desk, the ink still fresh. "Now," I said slowly, "I built it the way it should have been built from the start." The next morning, press releases went out. Not about collapse, about innovation. A new company, new governance, same core technology, stronger than before. Engineers who had been laid off rejoined within days. Clients who valued performance over politics migrated quietly. The market didn't care about family drama. It cared about results. But here's what no one saw publicly. The night the old company officially defaulted on its credit line, my mother sent a single text. "We never meant for this to happen." And for the first time since all of it began, I felt something crack inside me. Because intentions don't undo consequences. And love, when mixed with control, can become something unrecognizable. I stared at that message for a long time. Then I typed 3 words. "You forced it." She never responded. Weeks later, I learned the final blow. Because the company's valuation collapsed so quickly, my father had personally guaranteed part of its operational loan. He had believed it was safe, stable, predictable. Just like his accounting career, he didn't factor in one variable, me. And now the debt wasn't symbolic. It was real. The $1 company had become a liability that could cost him everything he tried to protect. And I was left with a question that kept me awake at night. Had I defended myself? Or had I just destroyed my family?
After the collapse of the family-controlled entity, my life didn't suddenly become easy. If anything, it became more complicated, but on my own terms. I spent the first few days in silence, watching the chaos unfold online. Internal messages from former clients leaked to LinkedIn. Confusion, frustration, disappointment. Investors called frantic meetings with their advisors. News outlets picked up whispers of family dispute destroys startup. And I sat back and watched it burn. Not because I enjoyed it, not because I wanted revenge, but because for the first time in months, I felt in control. I could choose the narrative. I could choose the timing. I could choose the people I trusted. The new company launch was carefully orchestrated. I called Lena first, my lead engineer, and explained everything. "You're not leaving, right?" I asked. She laughed softly. "After all this? Never. Let's build it right this time." We spent nights going over the architecture, identifying weak points and creating redundancies. We documented every single process so that no one could ever manipulate the company structure the way my parents had tried. It wasn't just a rebuild, it was a shield. The venture partner was impressed. They had never seen a founder handle betrayal and strategic collapse with such calculated calm. "You could have sued," the managing partner said. "You could have forced them into bankruptcy." I shook my head. That's not my style. I prefer to create, not destroy. But in my mind, I knew something critical. Sometimes creating requires dismantling what's already broken. Meanwhile, the fallout with my parents was complicated. Calls went unanswered, emails ignored. My mother occasionally sent cryptic texts. "We need to talk." I ignored most of them. I had spent too long trying to justify their behavior, to reason with them, to hold hope that blood meant loyalty. It didn't. Not when control was more important than trust. 3 months after the collapse, I visited the old company's office. The lights were off, desks empty, computers powered down. The European distributor had withdrawn completely. Employees had moved on. The place felt like a ghost of my own past. Walking through it, I realized something. Ownership is not just about legal documents. It's about respect, trust, and understanding. My parents have the documents. They had none of the rest. Around the same time, I began receiving offers from other investors intrigued by the drama. Some called it a cautionary tale. Others called it genius. I treated them all the same, carefully. No emotional decisions. Every term sheet examined with a microscope. Every clause read twice. Every potential partner vetted meticulously. Experience had taught me that vision without protection is fragile, and I wasn't going to make that mistake again. Then came the first major test. A competitor, an old rival who had watched our rise silently, tried to poach my clients from the family entity. They assumed the collapse would create fear. But my clients didn't call them. They called me. "They understand the technology, not the politics," one of them said. "And they trust you." It was a small victory, but it meant more than any investor email. It meant my vision still mattered. By the 6th month, the new company had officially launched. Branding, website, infrastructure, everything modern, scalable, and resilient. We integrated new features that competitors hadn't thought of, making the platform not just functional, but indispensable. I realized then that the betrayal, the pressure, the collapse, it had forced innovation. If my parents had never interfered, I might have stayed small, cautious, contained by their definition of safe. Now I was unstoppable. And yet the personal cost lingered. I hadn't spoken to my father in months. My mother's messages were sporadic and carefully measured. I knew that in their eyes, I was still the child who had disobeyed. I allowed myself a moment of guilt. For 5 minutes. Then I reminded myself, ambition cannot coexist with control when control is unjust. I wasn't cruel. I was protected. And protection sometimes requires consequences. The media eventually picked up the story. Headlines painted me as the prodigal founder, outsmarting family. Interviews called it a David versus Goliath narrative. I let them run the story, but I was selective. I never mentioned names. I never vilified. I told the truth carefully, emotionally, but factually. It was cathartic. It also set boundaries, because narrative, like patents, can be defended. By the end of the first year, the new company had surpassed the old company's peak valuation. Revenue doubled. The engineering team had grown stronger. Investors were confident. Clients were loyal. And me? I was exhausted, but in a way that felt earned. Every sleepless night, every negotiation, every strategic decision had been mine. No one could take that away. But the most striking moment came unexpectedly. One quiet evening, my mother called. "Your father, he wants to apologize," she said softly. I paused. I wasn't sure I was ready. "Tell him I'm listening," I said finally. He came over the next day, not with documents, not with threats, just a coffee in hand and the awkwardness of a man who realized he had misjudged the child he once tried to control. He began, fumbling. "I thought I was protecting you. I see now I made it about me." I listened, and I didn't respond immediately. Sometimes the truth needs to be absorbed quietly. We sat in silence for a while. Then I said, "You were wrong, but I understand why you thought you were right." He nodded. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet. But it was acknowledgement.
And sometimes acknowledgement is the first step toward healing. The next day, I walked into the office. Lena greeted me with a grin. "Clients just signed 3 new multi-year deals," she said. I smiled. It wasn't just success. It was vindication. It was proof that vision, integrity, and patience outlast manipulation. And it was proof that betrayal, even by the people you love, can sometimes fuel the fire needed to rise higher than before. At night, when the city lights glimmered outside my office window, I reflected on the journey. I had lost a company for $1. I had regained control through intellect, strategy, and patience. I had learned that family bonds don't automatically equate to trust. And I had learned that value, real value, isn't in dollars or contracts. It's in the vision, the creation, and the courage to protect it. As I closed my laptop that night, I realized something important. The story isn't about revenge. It's about ownership of your ideas, your vision, and your life. And for the first time, I felt entirely free.
The months that followed were a delicate balance between rebuilding the business and rebuilding myself. After the initial launch and early victories, I realized that the hardest part wasn't the betrayal, the lawsuits, or even the collapse. It was trust. I had to learn whom to trust, how to trust, and when to trust. Lena and the engineering team were the first. Their loyalty had been proven when the old company fell apart. They had stayed despite uncertainty, despite unpaid wages, despite chaos. They understood the stakes and, more importantly, respected the craft. The venture partners came next. They weren't emotionally invested. They were rational, analytical, and decisive, but they also understood my vision. That combination, trust built on competence and alignment, was rare. By month 4, I realized something crucial. The new company wasn't just about technology anymore. It was about culture. Culture isn't a spreadsheet. It isn't a patent. It's how people feel when they step into a room, or a Slack channel, or a Zoom call. I made it a priority to cultivate an environment where ideas mattered more than hierarchy, where failure was treated as learning, not punishment, where loyalty was earned through respect, not obligation. It was, in many ways, the opposite of what I experienced with my parents. Then the inevitable question came: the media. One technology reporter reached out, curious about the family drama. I could have leaned into it. Sensational headlines, drama, betrayal, the $1 sale that shocked Silicon Valley. Instead, I took a measured approach. I told the truth. Not the story of my parents' mistakes, not the story of revenge, the story of resilience, of protecting your intellectual property, of turning a collapse into opportunity. The article went viral in niche tech circles. Investors noticed, clients noticed, competitors noticed. But more importantly, the narrative was mine. I wasn't the victim. I wasn't the angry child. I was the founder who refused to surrender her creation. By month 6, the new company was operationally stronger than the old one. We had rebuilt the entire platform with modular systems. Security audits were complete. Patents and licensing frameworks were airtight. Any future attempt at interference, internal or external, was legally impossible. The European distributor who had once left came back, not as a favor, not because of sentiment, because the product worked, because value always finds a way. Seeing them return felt validating. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel proud, not just of the technology, but of the way I had protected it. But personal reconciliation remained elusive. I hadn't spoken to my father since the termination notice. My mother occasionally sent messages, but they were passive. She didn't argue anymore. She only asked questions about the business and my well-being. I realized then that what my parents needed most wasn't forgiveness. It was understanding. They had grown accustomed to control. They had equated love with oversight. And when I refused their control, they felt threatened. That understanding didn't erase betrayal. It didn't erase the damage, but it reframed it. Around month 8, something unexpected happened. A client I had personally worked with since day 1 called me with a proposal. "We want to license your technology exclusively," they said. "We need someone who understands the long-term vision,
not just short-term gains. I almost laughed. They didn't know the full story. They didn't know the family drama, the $1 sale, the collapse, or the patents. All they cared about was results. And in that moment, I realized something profound. The people who truly mattered, the clients, the team, the investors, valued competence, integrity, and vision over history, bloodlines, or drama. At night, I would sit at my desk and reflect on the journey. I had built a company from scratch, nurtured it, and then almost lost it due to familial interference. Yet in the collapse, I found clarity. I realized that ownership isn't just legal. It's emotional, strategic, and moral. It's the courage to protect what you've created. And sometimes that protection requires difficult decisions. I also learned an uncomfortable truth. Not all family loves you unconditionally. Some families, when confronted with success, feel threatened. Some prioritize legacy, control, or ego over the well-being of their child. It's painful, yes, but recognizing it early prevents further damage. And knowledge in this case became the ultimate tool. The next phase of the business involved expansion. We opened a new office in Berlin. We hired senior engineers who had previously dismissed my startup as too small. Now they wanted in. We scaled carefully, methodically. Every investment was strategic, every hire deliberate, every partnership vetted. I refused to rush growth. I refused to let emotion dictate business decisions, because emotion had almost cost me everything once. Then came a personal challenge I hadn't anticipated: scrutiny. Friends, acquaintances, and even distant relatives wanted commentary. Gossip spread online. People assumed I was bitter, vengeful, or reckless. I ignored most of it. I focused on work, on building, on proving that results mattered more than narratives. And slowly, the story shifted. Instead of focusing on betrayal, people began to focus on resilience, on ingenuity, on vision. I had transformed my pain into influence, my loss into strategy. By the end of the first year post-collapse, the new company had not only recovered but surpassed every metric of the old entity. Revenue had doubled, patents were fully enforced, clients were satisfied, the engineering team thrived, investors were confident. And me? I had rebuilt not just a company, but my confidence, my strategy, and my boundaries. I had learned lessons no classroom could teach. Blood doesn't guarantee loyalty. Trust must be earned, not assumed. Ownership is about protection as much as creation. Sometimes the right move is letting go of what you once held dear. One evening, Lena walked into my office holding a cup of coffee. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. I thought about the collapse, the betrayal, the months of rebuilding. "Not for a second," I said. It was the catalyst. It forced clarity. It forced action. And it forced me to understand the true meaning of ownership. She smiled. And in that moment, I knew something important. I had not just survived the betrayal, I had transcended it.
By the time the second year rolled around, the new company had become a formidable presence in the compliance automation industry. The chaos my parents had unleashed, forcing a $1 sale, the failed management, and the loss of critical clients had become nothing more than a story I occasionally shared with trusted colleagues, a lesson in vigilance and strategy. Yet, even with the business thriving, I couldn't shake a lingering tension. The shadow of betrayal had left its mark, not on the company, but on me. Every contract, every partnership, every negotiation carried the memory of what it meant to be undermined by someone you thought would protect you. The first real test of my resolve came from an unexpected angle. Investors who had watched the collapse of the old company closely. They were intrigued, yes, but skeptical. They wanted to know how a founder could recover so quickly, how she could rebuild both trust and infrastructure after such a dramatic failure. I shared the bare truth. Carefully, I highlighted lessons learned. I emphasized the patents, the engineering team's loyalty, and the meticulous rebuilding of governance structures. I framed it not as a story of vengeance, but as a story of strategic resilience. One partner leaned back, nodding slowly. "You turned a disaster into a competitive advantage," he said. "Most people would have crumbled. You leveraged it." I didn't smile immediately. The word leverage felt heavy. It reminded me of the leverage my father had tried to exert on me just months before. But in this context, it was different. Now I was the one holding it. Around the same time, the old company's creditors began calling my parents. The $1 acquisition hadn't just delivered value, it had left them financially exposed. Legal fees, operational liabilities, and investor demands were mounting. I heard about it through an old contact, not out of gloating, but out of necessity. They wanted insight into whether I would intervene. I did nothing. Let them face the consequences of their choices. It was an unusual feeling, detachment paired with a strange sense of justice, not revenge, justice, natural, inevitable consequences. Then came the most unexpected development. My father reached out. Not for reconciliation, not for legal maneuvering, not for negotiation. Just a single, honest request. "Can we talk?" I hesitated. Months of bitterness and caution coursed through me, but something in his voice suggested sincerity. I agreed. We met at a quiet cafe, neutral ground, early in the morning. He looked older than I remembered, and perhaps smaller, maybe because the control he had clung to was now gone. "I need to understand," he said. "I thought I was protecting you. I see now I was wrong." I listened, carefully. I didn't interrupt. I let him speak. It was not an apology, not yet, but acknowledgement can sometimes be more powerful than words. "You've built something incredible," he continued, "something I could have never imagined, and I tried to force it my way." I finally spoke. "You treated my success as your opportunity. That doesn't erase what you did, but it explains it." He nodded. It was the first time I truly understood the complexity of his perspective. Not justification, not forgiveness, just context. The conversation didn't end with reconciliation. There were no hugs, no promises of change, just understanding. And in that understanding, I found a strange peace. I realized that betrayal, even by family, doesn't have to define your future. It defines your strategy. It forces you to establish boundaries, to protect your vision, and to value loyalty where it exists. Meanwhile, the company continued to grow. The predictive compliance engine we had rebuilt became the gold standard in the market. Clients valued reliability and innovation over drama. Investors were pleased with the structured governance model. Engineers thrived in an environment where competence and creativity were recognized. I had rebuilt everything my parents had tried to take away, but this time stronger, smarter, and more resilient. 6 months into year 2, I received a call from a European client. "They're looking for an acquisition," the representative said. "Your technology is exactly what they need to dominate the market." I sat silently for a moment. This was the opportunity I had wanted all along, but without the desperation or manipulation my parents had tried to impose. This time it would be on my terms. I smiled. "Yes," I said, "let's explore it, but I lead the discussion." It was the first time I truly felt the power of autonomy, the freedom to make decisions based solely on my vision, not someone else's fear or ambition. Around the same period, the old company's journalist reached out to document the story of the $1 acquisition of a company. I agreed, but only under strict conditions. No names, no family drama, no gossip, just lessons. I shared the story as a cautionary tale of trust, control, and strategy. How ownership is more than legal documents. It's the ability to protect your intellectual property, your vision, and the people who help you build it. The article went viral, but it wasn't sensational. It was instructive, and I realized something profound. Sharing your story doesn't have to be about shame or blame. It can be about teaching others to protect themselves and their creations. Then came the internal reckoning. Lena approached me one evening, her face serious. "Do you ever regret it, letting them destroy the company, letting it fail?" I thought for a long moment. "No," I said finally. "It was painful, but it revealed everything. The gaps, the weaknesses, the people I could count on, and it gave me the clarity to rebuild properly. I wouldn't trade that clarity for comfort." She smiled, relieved. And I realized something essential. Betrayal, while painful, is also a teacher. Harsh, unforgiving, but brutally honest. By the end of year 2, the company had officially surpassed the valuation of the old entity by a factor of 3. Clients were returning, the predictive engine was recognized as revolutionary, investors were confident in the team, and the team, my real family, was stronger than ever. I had reclaimed my creation, not for revenge, not for money, but for ownership. Ownership of vision, ownership of strategy, ownership of consequences. And in the quiet moments, I reflected on what I had learned. I learned that family isn't automatically your ally in business, that trust must be earned and boundaries enforced, that intelligence, patience, and legal foresight can protect what brute force cannot. I also realize that success is not just about wealth or power, it's about control over your creation, respect for your vision, and loyalty to those who help you build it. And sometimes the harshest betrayals teach the deepest lessons, lessons no classroom or mentor could ever convey. As I closed my laptop one evening, I thought about the journey from the $1 betrayal to the thriving new company. The sleepless nights, the anxiety, the loss, the ultimate triumph. It had changed me, hardened me, yes, but it had also refined my strategy, clarified my values, and deepened my understanding of ownership and trust. I knew one truth, unshakable and undeniable. No one, not family, not investors, not competitors, could ever take away what I had earned through vision, strategy, and courage. And that, in the end, was the most valuable asset of all. The calm that had settled over my life was deceptive. Just when I thought the worst was behind me, the storm came back in a form I hadn't anticipated. It started with a simple email marked urgent from my old company's legal counsel. They claimed the termination notice I had sent was invalid, that there had been procedural errors, and that I was liable for damages. I read it twice. Then I called my attorney. "She's bluffing," my lawyer said. "They're desperate. They know the patents and licensing structure are airtight. They're hoping intimidation works." But I couldn't dismiss it entirely. The stakes had escalated. This wasn't about the $1 anymore. This was about legal reputation, future investments, and client confidence. Within 24 hours, I was contacted by an investor from my old network, someone who had previously backed the family-controlled company. "They're filing a lawsuit," he said. "They want a preliminary injunction to regain operational control. They might succeed temporarily, even if the final judgment favors you." Temporary control. Temporary. That word alone sent chills down my spine. I had spent 2 years meticulously rebuilding the company, restoring client trust, and fortifying infrastructure. Temporary disruption could undo months of work in a matter of days. I realized then that the final test wasn't just legal, it was psychological. Could I withstand the pressure without making a mistake that would undo everything? The first hearing was set in New York, in a cold, imposing courtroom. My parents, for the first time in months, were not the people I remembered. They were confident, controlled, and well-prepared, hired the best attorneys, studied every clause, and even rehearsed testimony. They were trying to win back control, not out of practicality, but out of pride. Sitting in the courtroom, I felt something I hadn't anticipated. Fear. Not fear for myself, fear for everything I had built, the employees counting on me, the clients depending on the platform, the investors who believed in my vision, and most of all, fear that despite all preparation, one wrong move could unravel it all. The courtroom was silent as the hearing began. My father's lawyer spoke first, citing procedural oversights and claiming that the license termination was invalid. The language was technical, precise, almost surgical. Then my attorney stood. She outlined the patents, the licensing agreements, and the legal contingencies I had prepared 2 years ago. She explained how every clause had been carefully drafted to protect intellectual property in case of interference. I watched my father's face. For the first time in years, he looked uncertain. He leaned forward, whispered to his attorney, then backpedaled slightly. I felt a flicker of something strange, vindication, but it was quickly replaced by anxiety. The hearing wasn't over yet. Then came the testimony. I was called to the stand. "Please state your role in the company," the judge asked. "Founder," I replied calmly. "Please explain the intellectual property structure," the opposing counsel demanded. I outlined the patents, the licensing agreements, and the contingencies I had in place 2 years ago. I spoke slowly, methodically, and confidently, every word measured, every pause intentional. The courtroom was tense. My parents were silent, their pride slowly morphing into shock as the full scope of my planning became apparent. After hours of testimony, cross-examination, and procedural arguments, the judge requested a recess before ruling on the preliminary injunction. I stepped outside, and the cool air hit me. I hadn't realized I was holding my breath. Lena was waiting outside. She gripped my arm. "You did it," she whispered. I shook my head. "Not yet. We're not done until the injunction is denied. One misstep could still derail everything." Her face hardened. "We're ready. The team is ready." I nodded, grateful but still aware of the stakes. Hours later, the judge returned. The courtroom fell silent. "The court has reviewed the evidence and finds that the license termination was valid and enforceable under the contract," the judge announced. Relief hit me like a wave, but it was tempered by exhaustion. My parents' faces fell. Shock, disbelief, and finally, anger. The preliminary injunction was denied. I retained full control. But I knew this wasn't the end. My parents could appeal. They could try other legal maneuvers. The tension wasn't over. 2 weeks later, my father called. Not with threats, not with negotiation, just a quiet voice. "You underestimated me," he said. There was no pride, no manipulation, just acknowledgement. I paused. This isn't about underestimation. It's about preparation, about foresight, about understanding what true ownership really means. He was silent for a moment. Then he said something I hadn't expected. "I don't know if I can fix what I've done." I realized that even now, the personal consequences of betrayal were not just legal, they were emotional. Families fractured, trust eroded, lessons learned too late. Meanwhile, the company surged forward. The European distributor reinstated the contract. Investors doubled down. The engineering team implemented new updates, making the predictive engine faster and more reliable than ever before. I began to see the true power of strategic resilience, not just winning, but anticipating threats, preparing for them, and using them to strengthen your foundation. And yet, I couldn't ignore the emotional toll. I had spent years fighting not just for a company, but for acknowledgement, for respect, for autonomy. The final test was internal. Could I forgive without losing vigilance? Could I protect without becoming ruthless? Could I move forward without being consumed by the past? Then came the final confrontation. My mother appeared in my office unannounced. Her face was pale, her hands trembling. I, I need to talk, she said, voice breaking. I invited her in, sitting across from me in my office. The room smelled faintly of coffee and new books, symbols of the life I had rebuilt. I don't know how it came to this, she said, voice breaking. I thought I was protecting you. I see now that I caused you pain instead. I didn't respond immediately. I studied her. There was regret, yes, but also fear. Fear that the consequences were irreversible. I can't undo what happened, I said finally, but I can choose how I move forward. She nodded, tears streaming silently. It was not reconciliation, not even close, but it was acknowledgement, and sometimes acknowledgement is the precursor to closure. The climax of the story wasn't in the courtroom, the emails, or the contracts. It was in the realization that true power lies not in control over others, but in control over yourself and your creation. My parents had tried to control me, thinking it was protection. I had survived, rebuilt, and strengthened because I controlled the variables I could. My intellect, my strategy, my team, my vision. And in that, I found the most profound victory: freedom. Weeks later, I stood in the office watching the city skyline as the sun set. Lena and a few team members were celebrating the latest client expansion. The office was filled with laughter, energy, and purpose. I realized then that the $1 betrayal, the months of legal battles, the family tension, all of it had forged something stronger. Not just a company, not just patents. A founder who would never again surrender control over her vision, who would protect her creations fiercely, and who would navigate both business and betrayal with clarity, courage, and strategy. The lessons were brutal, the tension immense, and the emotional stakes higher than anything I had faced. But in surviving, I had grown beyond what anyone, parents included, could ever understand. And for the first time, I felt invincible. The aftermath of the climax brought an unexpected quiet. The courtroom battles were over, the injunction denied, and the company was stronger than ever. Yet life felt different, not because of success, but because of perspective. I spent the mornings reflecting on the journey. I had survived betrayal by the people I loved most, rebuilt a company from ashes, and safeguarded intellectual property that had nearly been squandered. But the real lesson wasn't about patents, contracts, or balance sheets. It was about trust, boundaries, and self-respect. I began journaling again, something I hadn't done since the chaos began. I wrote down everything: the sleepless nights, the phone calls, the emails, the board meetings, the lies, the pressures. And then I asked myself a single question: what would I tell my younger self? The answer came slowly, painfully, and clearly. Protect yourself. Value your vision. Recognize who is truly on your side. It wasn't a bitter message. It was practical, hard-earned wisdom. I also had to confront my feelings about my parents. Months had passed since the courtroom. My father avoided contact. My mother occasionally sent cryptic messages, half apology, half inquiry about business developments. I realized that some relationships cannot be restored to their original state. Some people, even those closest to you, cannot fully comprehend the consequences of their actions. And that was okay, because protecting yourself doesn't require forgiveness, but it does require clarity. With clarity came focus. I poured my energy into the company. Expansion plans accelerated. New clients, previously hesitant, signed multi-year contracts. The predictive compliance engine became the industry standard. Competitors who once mocked our growth were now trying to keep up. Lena and the team thrived in an environment built on trust, respect, and competence. We implemented processes and structures designed not just for efficiency, but for resilience. Every patent, every line of code, every contractual agreement was fortified. Mistakes like those I had endured could never happen again.
But success wasn't just professional, it was personal. I had learned to set boundaries, to recognize manipulation, and to value loyalty. My team was my family now. Their trust, earned through years of collaboration, was unwavering. Their dedication, unlike my parents' interference, was not transactional. It was mutual. I realized that while family can hurt, chosen allies can heal, support, and elevate. Occasionally, the media reached out to revisit the $1 sale and its dramatic fallout. I declined most interviews, but in the few I accepted, I framed the story deliberately. It wasn't a tale of revenge. It wasn't a tale of anger. It was a lesson in foresight, resilience, and the importance of protecting your creations. The story resonated with aspiring entrepreneurs, young inventors, and even seasoned executives. They understood the core message. Ownership is more than legal paperwork. It's vigilance, strategy, and courage. By the end of the second year, the company's valuation had tripled compared to the old entity at its peak. Investors were satisfied, clients were happy, engineers were loyal, and I felt a calm satisfaction that I had never experienced before. Not pride, not vengeance, satisfaction. There were still echoes from the past. A creditor call here, a media query there, my parents' occasionally texts. Even family holidays were awkward, a reminder that blood ties don't erase conflict. But I had learned to navigate these echoes with strategy and composure. I didn't react emotionally. I didn't surrender control. I didn't allow the past to dictate the future. I had finally internalized the hardest lesson. Life isn't about avoiding betrayal. It's about surviving it with intelligence, integrity, and vision intact.